On a cold January morning in 1994, the quiet town of Maysville, Oklahoma was shattered by a crime that would haunt the community for decades. Inside the modest home of Otis Short, a 77-year-old farmer and respected member of the community, violence erupted. Short, an elderly man who had lived a long life of hard work and family devotion, suddenly became the target of a brutal robbery. That day, two intruders stormed his home: Jeffrey David Matthews, then just 21 years old, and his cousin, Tracy Dyer. Armed and desperate, they demanded money and valuables. But when Short and his wife couldn't produce what the men wanted, the robbery turned into something far worse. Otis Short was shot multiple times, left dying on his own floor. His wife was also shot in the head, but miraculously survived, becoming the only living witness to the terror inside that house. Investigators quickly connected Matthews and Dyer to the crime. Evidence placed them at the scene, and the murder weapon was discovered buried in the yard of a neighbor. The case seemed clear, but from the very beginning, Matthews insisted he was innocent, that Dyer had pulled the trigger, and that he was being wrongly accused of his own uncle's murder. For the next 17 years, Matthews fought to escape death row. His appeals pointed to flaws in the investigation, unreliable witness testimony, and a justice system too eager for conviction. Amnesty International even called on the state to reconsider, yet despite the doubts, the courts refused to change the outcome. In this video, we uncover the shocking murder of Otis Short, the long legal battle of Jeffrey David Matthews, and the execution that left lingering questions about guilt, justice, and the death penalty in America. Classification: murder, characteristics, robbery, number of victims, one date of murder, January 27, 1994, date of arrest, same day, date of birth, September 28, 1972. Victim profile: Otis Earl Short. 77, his great uncle. Method of murder: shooting, 5 caliber Ruger pistol. Location: McLean County, Oklahoma, USA. Status: executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma on January 11, 2011. Matthews and Tracy Dyer stormed into the home of Matthews' 7-year-old great uncle Otis Short, east of Rosedale, intending to rob him. Matthews shot Short once in the head at close range with a .45 caliber pistol, and Dyer cut the throat of Short's wife, Minnie Short. The men fled in Otis Short's truck with $500 in cash and a .32 caliber pistol. Minnie Short survived and died later of natural causes. The murder weapon was found buried in a field behind Matthews' house, and found a prescription bottle of Xanax issued to Minnie Short in his home. Dyer, 36, pled guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He testified against Matthews at trial. In 1996, he recanted, and after Matthews' case was reversed on appeal, testified on his behalf at the retrial. The result was the same. Let my mother know I love her. I just want to thank everyone for their support. I also want to thank all my buddies on death row. I hear you banging. I hate to see you all in this situation, Matthews told his relatives. I'm sitting here, enjoying my last moments. Enjoy your lives. I think that governor's phone is broke. He hadn't called yet. January 11, 2011. McAllister, a death row inmate whose execution was postponed 3 times, was put to death Tuesday for the murder of his great-uncle nearly 17 years ago. Jeffrey David Matthews, 38, was pronounced dead at 6:09 p.m. at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. State Department of Corrections spokesman Jerry Massey said. Matthews was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death for the Jan. 2794 killing of Otis Earl Short, 7, during a robbery at Short's McLean County home. Some of the prison's 76 other death row inmates loudly banged the heavy steel doors of their cells in tribute to Matthews, who, strapped to a gurney with needles in his arms, addressed 6 relatives who witnessed his execution. Let my mother know I love her, he said. I just want to thank everyone for their support. I also want to thank all my buddies on death row. I hear you banging. Shortly before the lethal drugs began flowing, Matthews looked at his relatives and said with a smile, I think that governor's phone is broke. He hadn't called yet. Prosecutors said Matthews was one of 2 men who stormed into Short's home east of Rosedale. Testimony indicated that Matthews shot Short once in the head at close range with a .45 caliber pistol, and that a second man, Tracy Dyer, cut the throat of Short's wife, Minnie Short. The men fled in Otis Short's truck with $500 in cash and a .32 caliber pistol. Minnie Short survived and died later of natural causes. Dyer, 36, was convicted of first-degree murder and other charges and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Matthews' execution was scheduled but stayed 3 times last year to give defense attorneys time to investigate his claims of innocence and to allow for his legal challenge of a change in execution drug protocol, January 11, 2011. Oklahoma City Reuters, Oklahoma put to death on Tuesday a man convicted of murder whose execution date was put off several times once by a debate over the drugs to be administered in the lethal injection. Jeffrey David Matthews, 38, was pronounced dead at 6:09 p.m. Tuesday at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester Department of Corrections, spokesman Jerry Massey said. Matthews' last words included, "I think that the governor's phone is broke. He ain't called yet." Matthews was convicted of murdering Otis Earl Shorts and his great-uncle during a robbery of the elderly man's home, according to court records. Matthews and an accomplice broke into the man's home, cut his wife's throat, and shot Short in the back of the head, according to the account. They stole $500 pickup and a .32 caliber pistol, according to the records. The man's wife survived. Matthews' execution was stayed several times once because the state of Oklahoma changed the drug used as a sedative during execution because of a shortage of the drug usually used. The new drug was administered on Matthews, Massey said. His last meal was a deep dish meat lover's pizza, deep-fried jumbo shrimp, and 2 hush puppies with vinegar sauce, Massey said. Matthews' execution was the second in Oklahoma and the United States this year. The number of U.S. executions fell 12% last year, the Death Penalty Information Center, January 11, 2011. McAlester, an Oklahoma death row inmate whose execution was postponed 3 times, was put to death Tuesday for the murder of his 77-year-old great-uncle almost 17 years ago. Jeffrey David Matthews, 38, was pronounced dead at 6:09 p.m. at Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, State Department of Corrections, spokesman Jerry Massey said. Matthews was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death for the John 2794 slaying of Otis Earl Short during a robbery at his McLean County home. Matthews, strapped to a hospital gurney with needles in his arms, addressed 6 family members who witnessed his execution. Some of the prison's 76 other death row inmates loudly banged the heavy steel doors of their cells. "Let my mother know I love her," Matthews said as he looked through a window separating the death chamber from the room where family members and spectators were seated. "I love you too," replied a woman whose name wasn't released by prison officials. "I just want to thank everyone for their support," Matthews continued. "I also want to thank all my buddies on death row. I hear you banging." Matthews said he left final notes to his family as well as the family of the victim, but he never directly addressed 10 of the victim's family members who also witnessed the execution. "I hate to see you all in this situation," Matthews told his relatives. "I'm sitting here enjoying my last moments. Enjoy your lives." Shortly before the lethal drugs began flowing at 6:04 p.m., Matthews looked at his family members and said with a smile, "I think the governor's phone is broke. He hadn't called yet." Matthews took several deep breaths as the drugs flowed into his body. His eyes remained open as his face turned ashen. He eventually stopped breathing and remained motionless. After he was pronounced dead, a family member looked at a prison official and said, "Can I have his glasses?" Prosecutors contended that Matthews was one of 2 men who stormed into Short's home east of Rosedale. Trial testimony indicated Matthews shot Short once in the head at close range with a .45 caliber pistol, and that the second man, Tracy Dyer, cut the throat of his wife, Minnie Short. The men searched the house for almost 2 hours, eventually leaving in Otis Short's truck with $500 in cash and a .32 caliber pistol. Minnie Short survived the attack and later died of natural causes. Matthews was arrested the day after the attacks. Attorney General Scott Pruitt, who witnessed Matthews' execution, issued a statement Tuesday that said Matthews was convicted of a crime that was exceptionally brutal. "My prayers are with the Short family, and I am hopeful that justice being carried out on behalf of the victims today will help bring closure and healing," Pruitt said. Mike Ritzie, our Broken Arrow State District Judge Tom Lucas and Department of Corrections Justin Jones also witnessed the execution. Matthews' 1995 trial was moved to Cleveland County because of pretrial publicity. He was tried a second time in 1999 after the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals overturned his first conviction. Dyer, 36, was convicted of first-degree murder and other charges at a separate trial and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Execution delays. Matthews' execution was scheduled but stayed 3 times last year. Former Governor Brad Henry twice granted stays to give defense attorneys time to investigate Matthews' claims of innocence. Execution dates of June 17th and July 20th were postponed, while fingerprint evidence from the crime scene was re-examined and defense attorneys searched for other possible suspects. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation could not match the fingerprints to any other alleged suspect, according to an Aug 9 letter to the State Pardon and Parole Board from Assistant Attorney General Seth Branham. Matthews' next execution date, Aug 17, was postponed after defense attorneys objected to corrections officials' plans to substitute one of 3 drugs in the lethal injection protocol because of a nationwide shortage. A federal judge ruled in November that the state could make the substitution. The U.S. Supreme Court on Monday denied Matthews' application for a 4th stay, clearing the way for his execution. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board denied Matthews' request for clemency May 26 after members of the victim's family urged the board to reject Matthews' request that his life be spared. I do not believe in killing people, but when someone so close to you is taken away, you realize there are some people in this world that deserve justice, and he is one of them, Don Randolph Short's great-grandchild wrote in a letter to the board. Members of the victim's family made no comments after the execution. Matthews is the second Oklahoma death row inmate to be executed in as many weeks. Billy Don Alverson, 39, was executed Thursday for the 1995 killing of a convenience store worker, marking the first execution in the U.S. this year. No other executions are scheduled in the state. On January 27, 1994, at around 6 o'clock in the morning, Minnie Short was awakened by a noise in her home in McLean County, Oklahoma. As she walked from her bedroom into the living room to investigate, an intruder wielding a knife attacked. The intruder cut Mrs. Short's throat, but still she remained conscious. When Mrs. Short's husband, Earl, followed her into the living room a few moments later, another intruder shot him in the head. Mr. Short died within minutes. The attackers then ordered Mrs. Short to lie still. They asked her where she hid her money. The 2 men kept Mrs. Short prisoner in her home while they searched it for nearly 2 hours, eventually leaving in the Shorts' truck with $500 cash and a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson taken from the house. After the intruders left, Mrs. Short walked down a nearby road to seek help. A passing ambulance came to her aid, and police were notified of the attack. In response to police questioning, Mrs. Short recalled that the man who stabbed her wore a dark jacket and that the man who shot her husband wore tan, loose-fitting clothes. Mrs. Short also told police that the man who stabbed her made a telephone call from the kitchen just prior to leaving. Police traced this phone call and determined it was made at 8:16 a.m. to a Bill Gwynn in Oklahoma City. Police promptly contacted Mr. Gwynn, who told them he received a call at that time from his nephew and employee, Tracy Dyer. Dyer had called to say that he would be late to work that morning because of car problems. Police then located Dyer and took him to the sheriff's office for questioning. There, Dyer admitted that he and Jeffrey Matthews, a great-nephew of Earl and Minnie Short, went to the house to look for money they thought was hidden there. Dyer blamed Matthews for the attacks on the Shorts. Police arrested Dyer and secured an arrest warrant for Matthews. They also executed a search of Matthews's home where they seized a pair of brown coveralls, 3 $100 bills found in the freezer, and a prescription pill bottle for Xanax issued to Minnie Short. Officers also searched the backyard but found nothing. 5 months later, however, in June of 1994, one of Matthews' neighbors found a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver buried in a field directly behind Matthews' house. The gun was later identified as the gun taken from the Shorts' home by their attackers. The police then returned to the same field with metal detectors and found another buried gun, a .45 caliber Ruger pistol that tests proved was used to kill Earl Short. In due course, Matthews was charged with first-degree murder and various other crimes. At trial, Dyer testified against Matthews, implicating him as Dyer's accomplice in the crime. At the close of evidence, the jury found Matthews guilty and sentenced him to death. Dyer pled guilty and received a sentence of life in prison. On appeal, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, OCCA, reversed Matthews' conviction and ordered a new trial. It held that the trial court erroneously admitted statements by Matthews that were the product of an illegal arrest. Matthews was then retried. At the second trial, the state again called Dyer to the stand, but this time he told a different story. Instead of implicating Matthews in the shooting, as he had in the first trial, this time Dyer testified that Matthews was not even involved in the break-in. When confronted by the government with his conflicting testimony from the first trial, Dyer said he had lied because prison guards and prosecutors threatened to harm him if he did not cooperate. Despite Dyer's about-face, the jury found Matthews guilty of all charges against him. With respect to the first-degree murder charge, the jury also found the existence of two aggravating circumstances. Matthews's action caused a great risk of death to more than one person, and two, he committed the offense while under custodial supervision. Based on those aggravating circumstances, the jury sentenced Matthews to death. This execution date was set after Oklahoma Gov. Brad Henry agreed to stay Matthews' June 17, 2010 execution after defense attorneys requested more time to review fingerprint evidence, Sunday, July 25, 2010. The governor of Oklahoma has extended the stay of execution for Jeffrey Matthews until 17 August. He was sentenced to death for the murder of his great-uncle Earl Short in 1994. Jeffrey Matthews' left was scheduled to be executed on 20 July 2010, but on 15 July, Governor Brad Henry extended the stay at the request of the defense lawyers, and a new execution date was set for 17 August. Jeffrey Matthews was originally scheduled to be executed in June, but a stay of execution was granted after his lawyers made the request to review fingerprint evidence. His lawyers requested this second reprieve on the grounds that more time was needed to complete the review. They had sought to have unidentified fingerprints obtained at the crime scene compared to those of other possible suspects. In 2008, they were told that the prints had been lost or destroyed. However, 10 days before the execution, they were located. On 26th of May, the State Pardon and Parole Board voted by 3 votes to 2 to deny clemency to Jeffrey Matthews. In Oklahoma, the governor cannot consider granting clemency without the board first recommending him to do so. There is no physical evidence, hair fiber, blood, DNA, fingerprints, or gunshot residue linking Jeffrey Matthews to the crime he was sentenced for in 1995. At Jeffrey Matthews' trial, Tracy Dyer, who had pleaded guilty under a plea agreement and had been sentenced to life imprisonment, testified against him. In 1996, Tracy Dyer retracted his trial testimony. Dyer alleged that he had lied at the trial because he had been beaten in jail and threatened by guards with further violence or death if he did not cooperate in the case against Matthews. In his signed statement, he added that by reaching his plea agreement, he was assured of being transferred out of jail and of avoiding the death penalty. In 1998, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals ordered a new trial because of an error in relation to the admission of evidence. Jeffrey Matthews was retried in 1999. This time, despite the threat that the prosecutor would revoke the plea agreement, Tracy Dyer testified that Matthews was innocent. He said that he had lied at the original trial, saying, "I've lived with a guilty conscience for this whole time. I ain't gonna live with it no more." Nevertheless, the jury convicted Jeffrey Matthews and sentenced him to death. Background information. At Jeffrey Matthews' 1999 trial, the jury handed down a guilty verdict in the early hours of Saturday, 10th April. The sentencing was set for the following Monday, and the judge sent the jurors home with the order that they not discuss the case with anyone. It was revealed after the trial, however, that one of the jurors, juror number 2, had telephoned an alternate substitute juror who had earlier been discharged from service in the case. Juror number 2 told him of the verdict and the length of the deliberations, to which he responded that the jury had done the right thing, and added that articles in the newspaper supported a finding of guilt. The defense filed a motion for a new trial. The judge held a hearing at which 2 other jurors reported that juror number 2 had told them of her conversation with the alternate juror. One of these jurors, juror number 8, added that this information had not altered her sentencing decision because she had already made up her mind to vote for the death penalty before the sentencing phase began. Upholding the death sentence in 2009, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit found that juror number 2 had undoubtedly engaged in misconduct implicating the defendant's constitutional due process right to a fair trial. However, the federal court ruled that it could not conclude that juror number 2's conversation with the alternate juror, however inappropriate, substantially influenced the jury's sentence of death. On the question of juror 8's admission, the state courts had earlier ruled that this information was inadmissible under Oklahoma law. The 10th Circuit ruled that it could not say under the deferential standard owed by federal to state courts under U.S. law that this was reversible error. The appeal courts have also rejected claims that Jeffrey Matthews' legal representation at trial was inadequate. For example, the defense presented no witnesses at the innocence guilt phase of the trial, including possible alibi witnesses. In addition, they did not cross-examine or call as a defense witness Tracy Dyer to elicit from him information that might have helped explain incriminating circumstantial evidence used against Jeffrey Matthews. For example, a medicine bottle belonging to Minnie Short was found in Matthews' home the day after the crime. Dyer had allegedly given Matthews the bottle after the crime. Another key piece of evidence was that 5 months after Jeffrey Matthews was arrested, the murder weapon and another gun stolen in the burglary were found buried in the ground just beyond the backyard of his home. In a sworn statement signed in 2007, Michael Mars, a former deputy sheriff who was involved in the 1994 investigation of the crime at the Shorts' home, said that he found this evidence suspicious and suggested that if the guns had been planted by Matthews, the signs of fresh digging would have been much more apparent when the premises were searched upon his arrest as opposed to half a year later. He added that in his view it was plausible that others had planted the weapons there after Matthews was arrested. In his statement, Michael Mars described the police handling of the case as sloppy, claiming that officials had been very quick to target Matthews to the exclusion of other possible suspects, and that some of the officers appeared highly motivated from the outset to pin Matthews with this crime. He claimed that after Tracy Dyer was brought into the police station, the sheriff had taken the highly unusual step of telling 10 deputies, including Mars, to leave and go for dinner. Upon their return, they were informed that Dyer had identified Matthews as his accomplice, but that his statement had not been tape recorded, as was normal policy. In addition, Mars stated that he found Tracy Dyer's allegations of abuse in pretrial custody to be plausible, adding that, "I can attest that I have seen a detention deputy both physically and verbally abuse prisoners many times." International safeguards require that the death penalty not be imposed if guilt is not based upon clear and convincing evidence, leaving no room for an alternative explanation of the facts. Amnesty International opposes the death penalty regardless of guilt or innocence. The USA has carried out 219 executions since resuming judicial killing in 1977, during which time more than 125 people have been released from death rows around the country on grounds of innocence. Oklahoma accounts for 92 of these executions and 10 of the wrongful convictions. There have been 31 executions in the USA this year, one of them in Oklahoma. The execution of Jeffrey David Matthews on January 11th, 2011, marked the end of a case that spanned nearly 2 decades. For the family of Otis Short, the 77-year-old man who lost his life that cold January morning in 1994, the sentence represented justice finally served. Yet, for many others, the case raised troubling questions. Matthews never stopped proclaiming his innocence, insisting that his cousin, Tracy Dyer, was the real killer. Despite evidence presented at trial, doubts lingered, doubts echoed by human rights groups and defense attorneys who argued that the system had failed to uncover the full truth. Was Matthews truly guilty of murder, or was he condemned for simply being in the wrong place with the wrong person at the wrong time? What remains certain is that a family was shattered, a community scarred, and a man's life ended in the name of justice. Matthews' story highlights the deep divisions over capital punishment and reminds us of the irreversible weight of the death penalty.